morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. We're going to be talking about taxonomy in Arctos today, how to create, manage, and use taxon names. And I'm Teresa Mayfield-Meyer. I'm one of the data migration specialists, um, and I'll be doing a lot of the talking at the beginning, but we'll have Q&A at the end. So uh, come up with your questions and be ready to share. Dang it, I can't get this thing to forward. There we go. Okay. So the first thing is that taxon names are shared across all of Arctos. So taxonomy in Arctos is a little bit different from probably any other system you've ever worked with taxonomy in. And to simplify it a bit, there's kind of two tables related to taxonomy. One is the names, and the other is the classifications. And both of these are shared, but they're shared a little bit differently. So, what is a taxon name? Taxonomy in Arctos is some formal naming system. Because we have collections in Arctos that aren't biological collections, we have other kinds of taxonomy. So it's not necessarily hierarchical. It's not limited to biological taxonomies. And Arctos doesn't really specifically follow any organization or committee guidelines related to taxonomy. And so this is both a benefit and a little bit of a curse, but it allows us to do what is shown on this slide, which is the name iron is in our list of taxonomy names, and in the classifications, it is a genus in biology, a species in mineralogy, and a primary object term for cultural collections. So, how do all these things work together with identifications? Taxon names is just a list of names, and they're intended to be formal taxonomic authorities, and they should be drawn from relevant taxonomic publications. Names are not linked to specific classifications. The linking kind of goes the other way around. So a name can be linked to multiple classifications, but every classification is linked to some name. So, because the name iron correctly includes classifications for plants, insects, minerals, and cultural objects, the name iron is associated with multiple classifications in Arctos. And then these things are all used to create identifications, which use taxon names to associate classifications to cataloged items. So, what is a taxon name? It's and how does it work in Arctos? A taxon name is what gets displayed by default in Arctos, but you can force a different kind of display name by adding a display name term in the taxonomic source so the classification can have a different display name. Names are unique within Arctos, so you can only have iron once in the list of names. They're used as a picker for tools like bulk loaders and data entry, and names have very limited metadata. That metadata includes the name type. So the name type is can lend certain attributes to a name. So if a name is typed as Linnaean, it follows certain rules related to Linnaean taxonomy. The other types of names have fewer or no rules. So in general, when a name is shared across different functional areas, then the Linnaean type is better to choose so that that way for the biological collections, it's kind of forced to be into the correct format. The other metadata associated with names are publications, and these are generally publications that detail the name and its creation. So they should directly support the name. And then relationships. And this could be synonyms or other ways that names are related to each other. And there's how-tos on how to do these things. And we'll kind of walk through an example later. The formatting of names. So names in general cannot contain extraneous spaces or non-printing characters. And then Linnaean names cannot include any punctuation except the punctuation that's found in the infra-specific rank code table. And they can only include one capital letter. So this helps the binomials get formatted properly. So let's take a look at what a taxon name looks like. First of all, I'm going to just really quickly show you how to search for a name. You do search and taxonomy, and then put your name here. And I'm going to use iron a lot today. You'll get a list of results that match what you put in, and we're going to pick the first one here. When you go to any name page in Arctos, you're going to see this exact same format. The first thing that you see are some links to jump to other parts of things about the name. You could edit the name, or you can manage taxon concepts, which we're not going to cover in this training. But beneath that are these different sections. And first is usage. So how is this name being used within Arctos? So you can see all the collections that are using the name, and then you can see the taxonomic sources that they have related to the name. And then there's external validation here. This comes from global names. So basically, it goes to global names and uses the name that you have up here and says, did we find it in any of these sources? And you can see it's found in quite a few here. Below this, you have other Arctos information, so georeference records that are identified using the name, relationships to the name, and then you get to the classifications, and we'll go look at this later. But this is what any name, taxon name in Arctos looks like. So now let's talk about classifications. Arctos includes many sources of taxonomic classification, and there's a code table for the sources that you can visit to see what they are. Many of these are managed by specific individuals or groups of users, but Arctos and Arctos plant sources are managed by anyone who has managed taxonomy permissions. So if you have managed taxonomy, you can work in those. Not every taxon name has a classification, which is sad, but every classification is associated with a name. Every classification stands alone, which can lead to inconsistent data, and we'll have a demonstration of that later. And classifications include two types of information. There's metadata, which are not part of the classification, but they clarify and augment the taxon classification. And then there's hierarchical terms, and these are the things you think about when you think about a Linnaean classification, where you have, family and order and such. So, formatting in classification. The terms cannot contain extraneous spaces or non-printing characters, and the terms are almost always free text. So, when you're creating a classification, it's very important to review it carefully and make sure you've spelled everything correctly. So, now we'll go look at the classifications. I'm just going to jump down here. And when you go to the classification section of a taxon name, the first thing you see is here's all the sources that include that name. And the bolded ones are ones that are local to Arctos, so they can be edited. Arctos by anybody, but so for instance, this Dana 8, I created that by doing a download and transmogrifying that data into Arctos format and loading it. So it's not editable by anybody. It basically requires somebody to do that exact same process again and upload all of the classifications in that source. We'll go look at this Arctos one. When you click on any of those, it takes you down to the here is the classification that's in that source. So in Arctos, the classification that gets included is this big long one for insects, but then there's also other sources below that, which is like catalog of life, which gets pulled in from global names. And you can see catalog of life has three different classifications for this name. So clearly there's something going on there. There's the Dana 8 version, and GBIF Backbone has a couple of versions. So there's a whole lot of different classification sources listed here, but the ones that probably matter to anybody who's working with taxonomy are the ones that they can edit. So, and you can see the ones you can edit because you'll get a little edit button there. But this is what a classification looks like. It's got some information up at the top about when it was last updated and if it's in global names. And then this section here is the metadata about the classification. And then you have the actual classification itself. And all of these links here let you skip to other places within taxonomy. If you're interested in looking, for more terms that are like this or everything that's in this rank, which that might melt. But for some of the lower ones, it might be nice to, find all of the species within a genus or something like that. Okay, searching for taxon names, which we just did this. So you guys have seen this interface. It's pretty simple and there's not a lot of options for doing searches, but it's basically the different values that are involved in the name and the classification. So it lets you search for names based on classifications as well. Um, the thing about searching for taxon names is there are some maybe kind of hidden rules about it. When you search on taxon name, it's a literal search. So whatever you type in there, it's going to first do starts with and look for all the names that start with whatever you typed in there. It's not going to bring up a bunch of close matches or things that seem like that. It's only going to look for the whatever you type in the field. And I actually, if you're searching for a name and you're unsure of the spelling, if you can at least know the first 4 or 5 characters, and depending on the name, it's better to just use that starts with than to put in the full name. And if it's misspelled, you won't find anything, but there may be an alternate spelling that's there. So it's better to kind of fudge it at first if you're looking for names in Arctos. Also, in this search, some of the special characters that you can use in other places for Arctos, like, matches any single character or matches any string, they don't work in this search. So, really quickly, I just want to show you guys what I mean by this. And one thing, anytime you're in a taxon page, at the very top is the search. So you can just scroll right up to the top and you're back at the search. But for instance, if we were misspelling things and did a search, it's going to come up with nothing. So it's not going to say, maybe you meant this. But it will ignore capitalization. So it's still going to find the thing. When you get a giant list like this, it can be sometimes hard, and sometimes your list exceeds the results that you can see. So then you have to think about ways to search a little more creatively to get to the name you're looking for or to make sure that it doesn't exist. But the search page is pretty simple. I could also add terms in here. Like if I only wanted one that had um, a specific term either in the classification or the metadata, I can put that in here and have it search for those as well. So, community considerations. Taxonomic names are shared by everybody in Arctos. There's one huge list of names. So, it's really important if you're going to be adding names that you're careful and add appropriate names. So, if you're not certain about a name, it's better not to add it and maybe just file a GitHub issue and ask people about it before it gets added. Anytime you do add a name, it's great if you can add a publication where the name was first described. Um, and also, a name doesn't necessarily have to be valid or accepted or even properly spelled. But if you're adding a name, there needs to be a good reason. And if it is an invalid name or a misspelling that's maybe been used in publications, then adding an appropriate relationship to the valid name is really important. So, if you're going to start creating names, just remember they're shared by everybody, so always use caution when you're creating or editing any of these shared resources. Search thoroughly before you add a name to make sure that the name you want to create isn't already there. Maybe it's an alternate spelling and that spelling is better, and you should just use that. Um, Use a known component of the taxon name classification or unidentifiable when the name is ambiguous. So, if you had a name that you weren't sure was an actual taxonomic name and you needed to use it in an identification, there's ways you can do that without creating the name in Arctos, and we'll get to that later. Also, we do have an unknown taxon name, and it's called unidentifiable. So, if you don't know how to identify something, the term you should use is unidentifiable. Don't go creating other names that are the same as unidentifiable, like unknown or taxon unknown or something like that. Just use unidentifiable. So let's talk about creating and editing taxon names. If I click that edit button or I want to create a new name, this is what I'm going to see. And you can see that creating a name is actually kind of simple. You can add the publication that describes the name or not. You can add a relationship to the name. And then if you're editing a name, you are unable to change it if it's already been used in identification somewhere. Um, I have run across names that were added to Arctos a long time ago that were misspelled and nobody was using, so I could just change their spelling and move on. But that's kind of rare. So most of the names that you want to edit, you're probably not actually editing the name, you're just adding a publication or a relationship. So when you're creating names, make certain your spelling's correct, add a publication if you can, add relationships to clarify synonymized or superseded names, and add an appropriate classification in the taxonomy source used by your collection at the very least. Don't create a name that's equivalent to unidentifiable. Don't abbreviate. Don't add misspellings unless they've been published, because sometimes people will read a publication and go look for this misspelled name. So it's okay to do it in that case. But if you do, add an appropriate relationship to the correctly spelled name. Don't create an orphan name. So if you create a name, always add at least one classification in Arctos. And don't embed data in names. So don't add a name like iron spa or iron with the subgenus in parentheses in the middle, special, or don't put the author name in the name. Just add the name. So let's go to edit a name. And I'm just going to go to iron again. And if we wanted to edit a name, we'll just hit this. And let's just say I found the publication that defined iron in mineral collections. Ha ha ha. I would add the publication if it's already in Arctos. If it's not in Arctos, I would create it first and then add it. So this adding a publication requires that the publication be added in Arctos, which is a whole nother training. Um, and then I would maybe add a relationship if I needed to. I will not be able to change this name because it's used. But you can see how editing or creating a name is really kind of a simple process. You always have to make sure you hit save change when you're done. Okay, now let's talk about the classifications that are related to names and what those mean for the community. So, sources are shared. The Arctos source is the one that a lot of people use because it just has almost everything in there. Arctos plants, the herbaria mostly use, but there are also plants in the Arctos source. So, those two kind of overlap a little. The main thing is if you are editing a classification, make sure you're not changing the fundamental nature of it unless you're certain that the whole community agrees. And I think maybe a bunch of you saw that Derek recently sent an email out to the community about this big, I think it was a family of insects that got some section of them got moved to another family, and he's going to do that in the Arctos source, but he wants to make sure everybody agrees with it or there's no, nobody's pushing back before he does it. So anytime you're doing some big change like that, it's important to check with the community. The one thing that can happen is we can have conflicting classifications within the source. So you can have two classifications within the Arctos source. One can be in one family and one can be in the other, or you can have one classification that has two families in it. So there's all kinds of ways that these classifications can still work for everybody, even if people are disagreeing on the taxonomy. Whenever you're making a change to a classification, you want to include as much metadata as possible about the change. For Linnaean taxa, I like to always check that there's a proper display name. And when you look at some of these classifications, you'll see a display name formatted like this, which in Arctos, when you're looking at a catalog record, will render in the identification as this. So if a classification doesn't have that, it's just going to render as the name. It won't have the author text. So it's just nice to have this extra bit there. And then citing your source is super important. A note on duplicate classifications. So they're not necessarily bad when you find two classifications within a source. They may indicate that somehow this name has been used uh, in two different ways or by two different types of collections. So in this case, this name represents both an insect and a fish, and one of them is probably not valid anymore, but we don't really, nobody's gone into Arctos and made that assessment. So these duplications, they might indicate changes to a taxon over time or uncertainty about a taxon, or they may be errors. And if you find something that's clearly an error, you can fix it. Classifications can be deleted even if a name is used. So that's a little bit scary. But if you find something that you think is an error and you're unsure, you can also file a GitHub issue, say you found this thing, provide a link to the taxon page, and ask for help. So, creating and editing classifications. When you're editing a classification, the interface that you see has two sections. There's the metadata section and the classification terms section. So, in the metadata section, there's a list of all the potential term types you might use. You don't have to fill in all of them. You don't have to fill in any of them. But the one thing that I always do for Linnaean taxa is put this nomenclatural code because it's going to tell Arctos how to format the name if it's biological or zoological. Um, and source authority. I think that's super important anytime you're adding or editing a classification to add your source. The classification terms are how you set up the hierarchy for this classification. So you can see this is our typical biological hierarchy, but you can move things around. If you start setting something up and they're out of order, you can use these little drag handles to move things around to get them in the correct order. And for the biological taxa, this order does matter. So it's good to make sure that they're all in the correct order. So let's look at editing a classification. So um, we'll look at this Arctos iron classification. You can see that in Arctos, we have it for the insects, but in Arctos it doesn't have Arctos plants. And so, but there is a World Flora online, which is kind of a trusted resource for a lot of plant people. And some people they might use this source as their preferred classification source, but some people might use Arctos plants. And so it would be nice to have this classification in Arctos plants. But you can also see when you look at these World World Flora online, none of these actually say iron, and that's because it's not used anymore for plants. So just to show you how this works, I'm going to clone this classification into Arctos plants. And whenever you're creating a classification for a name that already is in use in Arctos, it's always best to use these cloning options instead of creating something from scratch. So I'll hit this clone classification. The name that we're actually working on is iron. And the source is going to be Arctos plants, which, by the way, this shows you all the ones that are editable by anybody. Worms really isn't, but we can talk about that later. So we're going to use iron and we're going to create and edit the classification. And what this does is it takes everything that was in that World Flora Online classification and puts it into the new one that we're creating. So this stuff is all great, but it doesn't really populate metadata, which anything that you're cloning from outside of Arctos, it usually does not do this. So I would if I were going to go ahead and save all this, I would go back and forth and look up the author text in World Flora Online. I would create the display name. I would add the code. And then I would say the source authority was World Flora Online via global names because that's where it came from. So that's the creating and editing classifications. So you can see how you can drag things around here too to put things in different order. So there are batch tools for creating taxon names and classifications. And if you're migrating a bunch of data, these are great because the first thing you're going to do is get a list of all your taxon names and run it through this taxon name checker. And all that taxon name checker does is take your name and search for it in Arctos and tell you, yes, it's there, or no, it's not. The one great thing about the taxon name checker is it will sometimes provide you with, well, maybe you meant this. So that can help you when you get your list of names that aren't in Arctos. Some of them you might easily be able to see, oh, wait, I've misspelled it, or it's a different name. Then what you do with that information is decide, do I need to create all these names that aren't in Arctos, or should I be using a different name? How am I going to handle that? Um, If you decide you want to create a whole bunch of names, you can use the taxon name bulk load tool, and it's very simple, just like the creating a name interface. And all you do is provide the name and the name type, and then your names are created. Once you've created a bunch of new names, though, the next thing you want to do is add their classifications. And you can also bulk load these with a tool that just has a bunch of columns that let you add all the metadata and the terms in an order. And you can also bulk load name relationships. So if a whole list of species names maybe get changed because the genus has moved or something, you can bulk create a whole bunch of relationships between the old names and the new names. And it's a pretty simple bulk loader as well. So, taxon name migration flow. Find all your names, and you can pull these from your identifications. Um, if your data has names that include author text or other kinds of things like the SP period, all that should get removed before you check if they're in Arctos. So you want to kind of clean them up because Arctos is only going to have the what I call the bare name. Um, then you want to pick your format. Are you working with biological names? Then you'll use Linnaean, and you'll want to make sure that your formatted names match the Linnaean format. Then use the name checker to see if your names are in Arctos already. If they are, great, you can just use them. Or you may want to go look at the classifications related to them to make sure they, match what you think they should. Um, and then whatever names aren't in Arctos, you need to make decisions about. Do they need to be added, or do I need to use different names in my identifications? And then if you've created new names, you want to make classifications for those names. So, just a brief touching on identifications versus taxon names. So, identifications require a taxon name. Even if you want to use a name that you don't want to add to the taxon name list for whatever reason, you still have to provide a taxon name in order to make an identification. And so that could be anything from unidentifiable to maybe the name you have is like Bufo species A, and that's what you want to see on your record, then you would use Bufo as your taxon name, and species A would go in the brackets to do the A string format. So, but just know that any identification you make, there must be some related taxon name. So verbatim identification is what I briefly touched on, and there's kind of two verbatim identifications in Arctos. So there's this A string format that I discussed where the letter A represents a taxon name, and string is what you're going to see when you look at your identification in Arctos. This in that way, the classification that gets associated with whatever name you have in the string is related to this taxon. So it provides flexibility that you can have the name associated with your identification be whatever you want, but the classification is going to come from an Arctos source. The other form of verbatim identification is this identification attribute. So there's a couple of different attributes you can associate with an identification, and one of them is verbatim identification. And I often use this when I'm migrating a bunch of data, and during the process of checking our names, a decision's been made that, oh, the name we were using in our old data was this, but we really should have been using that. So we'll use that as the Arctos identification, but this will be listed in this verbatim identification attribute. It's kind of like keeping a historical record of what we did during the migration. So, verbatim versus real taxon names. A taxon name should exist only when it carries independent information. So, a taxon name really should have some sort of verifiable reason to exist. And if it doesn't, then using this A string formula is kind of functionally identical to that, but lets you use whatever text you want as the ID that's seen in Arctos. That format should be used for questionable names, and it's preferable to creating a taxon name that just really isn't an actual thing. And the verbatim identification attribute is great for capturing legacy data. I'm going to just touch on this briefly because we're not really talking about doing identifications in this training, but there are batch updates for catalog records. If you at some point determine that, oh, I have a bunch of stuff that's identified as this, and it really should be identified as that. There are bulk load tools that will let you do that in Arctos, and one of them is the identification bulk load. The other is the manage identifications in the catalog record search. But this one really needs to be used with caution because you will change a whole bunch of things and there's no, undo. So that's my brief introduction to managing taxonomy in Arctos.